What's going on, everybody? It is that time again. The Sooners Illustrated Podcast, episode 157 on this Friday, February 28th, 2025, final day of February. Josh Callaway, Collin Kennedy with you. We're getting close to recruiting, starting to ramp back up, getting out of that dead period coming up. We've got our 2026 recruiting storylines at a number of key positions that we're going to get into with Collin today. He's been going through that on the website, Oklahoma.247sports.com for our VIP members. We'll dip our toe a little bit in some of the things to know at some key spots in 2026 as things start to ramp up here in the very, very near future. Some visits coming in next weekend that we will talk about on the show next week. So we'll kind of get into what we're going to be watching for over the next several months in the 2026 recruiting ranks. But CK, before we do that, so we have to start with obviously the big news of the week for Oklahoma football. They've got a new GM. We didn't really know what the timeline was going to be for this. It seemed like Oklahoma was not in any big, huge rush to make a hire. Even, just really before the spring portal was kind of the general thought before then, anytime before then. And they went and just did it this week. Jim Nagy comes aboard, a splash hire, obviously a name that a lot of people know. But if you don't, he's been the executive director of the Senior Bowl since 2018. Obviously has an NFL background, extremely highly thought of and well regarded. And just look no further than the reaction online on Wednesday when OU announced this, both in the college football world as well as in the NFL world. It made headlines. People were kind of caught surprised all over the sport of football, again, both college and NFL, that Oklahoma made a hire like this. Collin, we'll dive into all the angles of it, but for you, when this thing popped on Wednesday, what was kind of the thing that jumped into your mind? This is first off, it's a total zigzag from Curtis Lofton before. It's completely different. And then also just the name. I mean, you want to make a splash? They made a splash here with Jim.
And speaking of the name, by the way, it's either Nagy or Nagy. We're going to figure it out, Jim. We promise we'll figure it out.
I apologize, Jim, if we're saying it wrong. I've heard Nagy. I've heard Nagy. I just went full send on Nagy, but it could easily be the other way, so I apologize to Jim.
I think you're Team Nagy, I'm Team Nagy, and hopefully we're able to meet in the middle with the right choice one day soon. But I did bring out a little NFL theme. Happy NFL Combine Week. Jim Nagy coming to Oklahoma from the NFL ranks of sorts. I did a little celebration of myself, even though the Cowboys are miserable. But the first thing that popped into my head when the announcement is revealed is this is far and away one of the most significant hires in terms of off-field staffers in all of college football. I think, and I feel like I can kind of speak to this as someone who has started to attend the NCAA Personnel Symposium in Nashville and has gotten to kind of really grasp the off-field personnel ranks and where that side of the industry is heading. I think there is a legitimate argument to make that with this hire, Oklahoma now has one of the top 3 to 5 general managers in the entire sport. And I think that speaks for itself, right? And where exactly Jim Nagy slides or slots, I think is obviously up for debate. But we knew going into this vacancy, it was arguably one of the most pivotal hires for the future of the program in Oklahoma history, considering where we're headed in college football. And obviously you had to nail a hiring of a head coach like a Brent Venables. That's still playing out. You had to get some of these coordinator hires right, like a Ben Arbuckle. But I really do believe that, in my opinion at least, the general manager hire was just as important as maybe the head coach hire a few years ago, because, again, the direction that this thing is taking. And if Oklahoma is going to fare well in today's modern landscape and whatever the next few years hold in terms of changes, they had to get this hire right. It's hard to find one better to do so than Jim Nagy. Again, we'll get into all the specifics, but in general, I firmly believe with this move, OU can claim one of the top 5 general managers in all of college football.
Hard to disagree. Look, I'm not going to pretend to know for sure if it's going to work, right? I mean, who knows? The GM position is still pretty relatively new to the sport of college football. And
it's still changing. It's still changing.
The sport is changing rapidly year by year. But at the very bare minimum least, it's a big swing. You have to credit Oklahoma for that. Jim doesn't come cheap, obviously. He had options. Obviously, there's reports that Florida was interested. There's reports that the New York Jets were interested in the NFL, that he interviewed or at least had conversations about those jobs. And Oklahoma got them. Like, they stepped up and they made a big hire. I don't know if anyone expected this kind of a hire for the GM spot. And like I kind of mentioned before, what a total just zigzag from Curtis Lofton before. And I don't want to make it sound like a disrespect toward Curtis, but obviously Curtis, former player, was in the program with the sole mission. They kind of just like said, this guy would be good for this. Let's have him do it. This is a legit, we need help type of hire. And Oklahoma kind of recognizing, like, we have work to do and we need someone who can really help get things back on track and fix this, for lack of a better term. It's a big swing. It's a big swing. I've seen people whose opinion I trust. Obviously, Collin, you love it. On a national level, I've seen you said home run. I've seen that. I've seen grand slam. I've seen one of the most significant hires that any college program has made from like an off-field staffing, like from people, again, that you feel like you value their opinion. So again, at the very least, it's a PR win. It got people talking. It's a name people know. And I mean, it's totally reasonable to expect that Jim's going to do a great job. I mean, with what he's done at the Senior Bowl, obviously for a long time, and his background before that in the NFL, like it seems like, again, I am hesitant to say can't miss, because who knows, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's college football. It's an ever-changing role. We could be 3 years down the road and, things don't really change. We're kind of like, did that help? I mean, that's possible, right? But it certainly seems like this is about as good of a hire as you could have possibly made for this role. And I'm very excited to see how it shakes out. And I'm excited to hear Brent Venables talk about it whenever we get that opportunity, just to kind of what went into the decision to go with Jim and what kind of value that he sees him bringing to the table, because it would seem to be a lot.
Look, there's no guarantee, like you mentioned, but at the very least on paper, I think that you look at this move, and beyond just myself, I think there are a lot of people out there who view this as Jim Nagy or Nagy taking a position that he's arguably overqualified for.
Yes.
I mean, think about that storyline. He is taking a position at OU that maybe he could take in the professional ranks or somewhere else in maybe a little bit more of a higher stature. I mean, I think, number one, to have Oklahoma pull him away from the Senior Bowl just in that vacuum is insanity. The staying power that he has there, that is a pretty much job for life that he had in place. But like, he legitimately interviewed with the New York Jets for their general manager position, the same position he's taking at Oklahoma, in December. So a few months later, after he's interviewing for GM jobs in the NFL, high stakes one too, by the way. The New York Jets, that's a certain tier. Yeah, it's a certain caliber tier, if you will, in the NFL. To go from that kind of being his career trajectory to taking this job, it goes to show you how willing Oklahoma was to take the shot and how serious they're taking this and how willing they are to be dedicated to the new age of college football. And I think it goes to show you what Jim Nagy sees in a place like Oklahoma. I mean, this hire, in my opinion, one thing I do want to get out there is pretty much independent of Brent Venables and the on-field staff. I think Jim Nagy is coming in here with an opportunity to lead the direction of this program, in a sense, with a lot of individual power. And I think that not only kind of speaks to how Jim Nagy views the opportunity ahead, it shows you what OU could potentially accomplish with him in the boat moving forward.
No doubt. I want to ask you kind of, I guess, the rest of this, because, there's been reports that basically the Jim wants to put together an NFL style of front office. Obviously, it's kind of crazy to see OU make these hires, right? Because they brought in Randall Stevenson, former AT&T, I believe, CEO, and they've made these kind of big front office-y hires, and it's hard to know how it all fits together, right? It's like, how do the pieces all fit? But I think there's a thought that more hires will be made beneath Jim as he wants to assemble this group and how Joe Castiglione fits in and how Brent Venables fits in. It's fascinating. I don't expect you to have all the answers, but just what are you kind of watching for, I guess, moving forward in terms of just how Oklahoma assembles this thing? Because it seems like they are being very aggressive in trying to keep up with the times, keep up with the Joneses, and try to come at this from an NFL standpoint in terms of talent acquisition, allocation of funds. Like, they're really trying to be very buttoned up as much as they possibly can, which is, I would think, a good sign if you're an OU fan.
You want to get into a to-do list of sorts for Jim Nagy, in my opinion. I think that there is a sort of a list of things to accomplish or to prioritize as he makes the hire. Spring ball starts next week at Oklahoma. And I think that the first thing to do is to come in, and I think he's arriving on campus pretty much right now. The quiet part out loud is across college football, spring practices are going to serve as an opportunity for self-evaluation and roster evaluation. And I think Jim Nagy coming in as a shot caller, the first thing he's going to do is watch these guys put helmets and shoulder pads on and go, I believe in him, maybe I don't, and get a plan in place for the spring portal window where we've heard, I don't want to say Oklahoma's going to be aggressive, but they're going to make some moves. And now with Jim Nagy in their corner, you have to think that gets ramped up even more because of the amount of say that he has going into it. So I believe that the roster evaluation for him himself, forming his own opinions on this program he now oversees, is step one. Step two, make the right hires to help him formulate not only the right decisions, but the right course of actions. And I think you're going to see an assistant general manager hire to replace the Chuck Lillys of the world.
Yeah.
I think at least on paper, you have an opportunity to hire maybe another assistant director of player personnel with JP Lossman heading out to Washington. You have Drew Hill in place, which is massive. You have Jolie Ale as the director of recruiting strategy in place as well. A couple of really big, very capable human beings who excel at their specific positions. And so I think Jim Nagy gives them the kind of keys right now and then fills out the rest of that staff with not only some of the vacancies that I mentioned. I wouldn't be surprised if, Josh, you see, for lack of a better term, like regional scouts being hired and guys coming in to, like you mentioned, work in an NFL front office model. As many of our listeners and viewers know, these NFL teams have regional guys. They have pretty much directors of player personnel who are assigned players and areas to evaluate and scout. And I think Jim Nagy takes this job with a strong understanding of just how much he's going to be able to hire or execute on that front. And I think that maybe some further personnel staffers is part of that beyond kind of your typical run-of-the-mill stuff in terms of a recruiting department, what that looks like. So I think that's next. Obviously, once you get through all of these hires and you get through the roster evaluation, you go into the spring portal. That's where we're really going to see Jim Nagy have his initial impact, whether it's internally or externally, evaluating and pursuing players. And then I think the negotiation aspect is massive in this. I think Curtis Lofton did a really darn good job stepping up and taking on that role for Oklahoma. But I think even he kind of mentioned that he struggled at times with the negotiation side of the equation. That's a massive part for Jim Nagy to come in and have those financial discussions and take that burden off of a number of people in the building. Get through the spring portal window. And then I think kind of the last thing that I would mention, I think one thing that maybe kind of flew under the radar, Josh, in the press release, but is very much relevant. We are getting ready for the revenue share model to activate in July. And part of Jim Nagy's job description in the press release, which I think we all kind of figured, was to work directly with the university and pretty much help decide the allocation of funding to OU football, where that cash is going, who you're spending money on, how you're spending it, things of that nature. And I mentioned this on the on the college football show the other day for 24/7 Sports 2. Let's just be honest. Like, the job that Jim Nagy did at the Senior Bowl from a marketing perspective and how he sort of knows to negotiate, but also build a brand and kind of barter back and forth in a market like Oklahoma, Josh, where maybe you're not competing as much with men's basketball for dollars and cents.
Yeah.
You've got a chance to sort of gain a couple extra dollars and cents for OU football if you go to the negotiating table at the university the right way. And I think Jim Nagy fully plans to do that. Now, I don't want to speak for him, but that's, to me, kind of the overarching list of things to do for him over the next few months. And there's every reason to believe that not only he will do a good job of all of this, the people he's going to bring in are going to do a good job because of the connections he has and the wide-ranging knowledge of the game and the people in the game that he knows.
Yeah.
And that's why I think all this combined makes him such an impressive hire on paper, because he checks all of these boxes and more.
You know, Oklahoma took a lot of heat, and Brent Venables took a lot of heat for not making enough changes, you know, after the season that they had, especially on the offensive staff in particular. That was the one that really jumped out. Obviously, brought in Ben Arbuckle, but there was some thought that there would be a couple of coaching changes on that staff. And, you know, it's about to be March, spring ball. Things could still happen. You never know. But for the most part, everything looks like it's going to largely be in place. Obviously, Zach Allen leaves on the defensive staff. You're replacing Nate Dreiling, and also Wes Goodwin comes in. But there was like this, there's been this kind of sentiment of they're kind of running it back, and Brent Venables is calling plays and, like, you know, that sort of thing. But it's been very clear that Oklahoma has been very aggressive, and you would hope so, but very aggressive in trying to overhaul just kind of their overall approach to just roster management and the modern landscape with NIL and everything. Like, I think if I'm an OU fan, I'm feeling at least encouraged by the almost admission by their actions of maybe what we were doing before was not the right approach, or maybe, you know, we need help. And they're making big hires, again, going back to Randall Stevenson, now Jim Nagy, like, and there'll be probably more hires to come, like Collin just outlined. It's I think very encouraging, these types of moves from a front office standpoint and off the field standpoint, that they're being very aggressive to get this thing back on the tracks, and they're going to do everything they can. And again, could you make the argument that maybe they should have foresaw things better, or, you know, I mean, you could pull at it a ton of different ways. There's a bunch of strings you can pull it apart, but this offseason, from this perspective, from the off the field, has been excellent. I mean, Oklahoma is trying. You can tell they're taking their best swings at getting everything as positioned as they need to be to try and get the roster to where it has to be to compete in the SEC at the highest level. So it's a heck of a hire. It made waves. Like I said, at the very least, it caught people's attention. It's a PR win. And it feels like this fan base, we are John Mateer looking really good in spring practice away from, I think, this fan base being back. We kind of wondered, you know, at the end of last season, we were kind of talking off air, like, you know, it's always, you know, around here, OU football is everything in this state. And so it was, are fans going to be in spring ball after the season they just had and morale was so low? Are they going to be in? Are they going to be able to get excited again in the offseason for next year's team? And there's still got a ways to go. And I think fans there's still a good contingent that are skeptical. And, you know, it's totally fair with the season they just had. But you're seeing some of the hires like this. I think people are excited about Ben Arbuckle. People are excited about John Mateer. And it's like, we're close to people being back in. You can't pull them away for too long. People are close to getting back in, I think.
Yeah. The last thing I'm going to say before we get out of this, and then I'd be curious to hear if you have anything else on the topic before we transition. Yeah. But the last thing I do want to kind of make clear for any of the viewers or listeners out there that might be curious or have this question. Jim Nagy taking this job, by all accounts, is independent of kind of what Josh talked about, the future on the field for Oklahoma football going into next year, where everything is on the line for the 2025 season regarding head coach Brent Venables and the rest of the OU football program from that perspective. But at the same time, I just want to make it abundantly clear, Jim Nagy is taking this job and Oklahoma is hiring him with the understanding he is the general manager of the future. So his future is independent of Brent Venables. I think there is this misconception out there and understandably so, because all of this is still relatively confusing. But I said it on the show a couple days ago. I'll say it here. This is quite literally taking on the NFL mold, where I think some people think in college football, the general manager works for the head coach.
Yeah.
The general manager now is working alongside the head coach, much like you see in the NFL. And it's my understanding that Jim Nagy is pretty much only reporting to Joe Castiglione and someone like a Randall Stevenson, for example. So not to say that like Brent Venables and Jim Nagy aren't going to work together. And I've heard that the two are close. They're very excited about this partnership. I think all of that works well. I just also wanted to make it clear on the pod today, like this hire is Oklahoma pretty much dedicating to the future of Jim Nagy as their guy at general manager, much like the hiring of Brent Venables was them saying, this is our guy at the head coach position. And I think that's another dynamic to consider as they make this hire.
No doubt. No, it's a great point. It's not, it's a good point. I mean, at least the plan, if we talked about Brent Venables, his future a little bit murky. Jim Nagy's probably here for at least OU's mind through, if there were to be a coaching change, through that. Yes. And that's something to keep in mind as we go along throughout next season, and we'll see how it all shakes out. Obviously, Oklahoma would certainly prefer for this season to go a lot better and don't have to worry about something like that, but that is something to keep in mind. That's a good point by you. So, we'll have more coverage as it goes along. Spring practice starts next week. A lot to be excited about, but a big hire, and certainly one that whenever OU football, which they announced this themselves, which is kind of rare that it wasn't broken anywhere. Whenever OU announced it themselves, it was a bit of a double take for me. Get that tweet notification pops up. It was like, who? What name?
Yeah.
Big hire. Yeah. Let's do some recruiting storylines for 2026. So Collin's been doing this on the website, Oklahoma247sports.com. Become a VIP subscriber right now. It's a great time to do it. Spring practice, again, starts next week. So we have a lot of stuff coming up. Recruiting is going to start to ramp back up. And we've got tons of Diamond sports coverage. Basketball is getting into postseason, things like that. So it's a great time to jump aboard right now. We got a few storyline things we want to hit in 2026 as that starts to ramp up as we shift into March, literally starting tomorrow. Let's start with quarterbacks, Collin. This has been something we talked about a couple times. It's, I think a lot of people thought at a point in time that this was done. I mean, you had Jaden O'Neal, that's your 2026 guy. But as we mentioned, Bo Bentley, that's kind of ramped up. What's the storyline here for you, watching with the QB position, Jaden O'Neal, Bo Bentley, and that whole dynamic as that continues to be an ever-living organism, that quarterback recruiting room in that 26 class?
Yeah, look, this series kind of came to mind for me because the national signing day for 2025 was this month, and it feels pretty much completely forgotten about, right?
Yeah.
But in 2025, I would say the biggest storyline for Oklahoma within that cycle was the offensive line recruiting and the pursuit of Michael Fasusi and putting that all together and how involved they were with some of the elite offensive linemen of the class. You turn to 2026, and we're getting ready for everyone in the college football landscape to turn the page to that cycle. This, to me, is the storyline that everyone nationally is talking about related to Oklahoma recruiting specifically in 2026. And we're only scratching the surface, right? So when the dead period lifts, I believe on Monday, we're going to dive right back into this thing, Josh. I was telling you a little bit about it when we were planning out the show, but I do think it's fascinating. We have more updates on this as of the last few days. Firstly, Bo Bentley is, for lack of a better term, not going away. Oklahoma's still very much involved. Yeah. And as many will recall, he visited Oklahoma just before this dead period hit. He was on campus, took that visit, hung out with John Mateer and Ben Arbuckle, and that kind of got things going. I believe I labeled that kind of the beginning of this process. Like a month goes by through this dead period, and we're going to get right back at it because Bo Bentley has scheduled another visit fresh out of the dead period for March 8th. So he's going to be at Future Freaks weekend next Saturday. We'll talk about all that stuff next week. But I do think that it's probably best to get the Bo Bentley thing out of the way now, because not only is it very clear he's still on OU's radar and OU is still very much invested in the recruitment of Bo, but at the same time, while all of this is getting ironed out, Jaden O'Neal has booked his official visit with Oklahoma. And it's not just any official visit. He right now is set for the Champion Barbecue weekend on June 20th.
Right.
Anything can happen, but simple logic would tell you that if you're planning to be a leader for a class, you book your OV for the highest profile weekend of the summer.
Yeah, that's their
now.
weekend. Yeah.
Right. And so Jaden O'Neal making that move and already going ahead and committing to the idea of the Champion Barbecue, I think that's very significant. Now, the other update here is while Jaden O'Neal did that and the Bo Bentley stuff is still getting figured out, and I do want to mention that, again, like Bo Bentley is not a foregone conclusion. In addition to the OU visit, he's lined up trips with LSU, Ohio State, Florida State, and Georgia Tech, I want to say. So a lot going on there. But Jaden O'Neal, just like Bo Bentley is still hearing from a lot of other schools while OU is involved, Jaden O'Neal started to really have the phone heat up a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's not only something to watch. Something I was thinking about the other night, Josh, is like, okay, let's say Jaden O'Neal does get approached by these schools and is asked to take an official visit. Is Oklahoma in a position to where they can really tell him, hey, like, you're committed to us, don't go?
Right. When you're courting another one. Yeah.
Something to think about. I think that's another layer to this storyline is OU has this, at least on paper, visit policy that I have always felt is a little bit overblown. I don't think people really understand it's not as serious as maybe some make it out to be, but it's still a thing. But we've never really had this dynamic shake out to where you have, like specifically a quarterback committed, and while you're going after another, with him very much aware of it, if schools do pursue him while he's pledged to you, how do they go about that? Do they have the authority to tell him no, or are they going to let him do his thing? And like, that's a whole can of worms we don't have time to open. But another thing to think about with this storyline, it continues to be fascinating. I thought it was really interesting. It was still heating up during the dead period. Yeah. And it's only going to get more intense once this thing lifts on Monday.
No, it's a fascinating dynamic. Because, again, we talked about it before, but you just don't get two QBs of this caliber to commit in the same class, the same school very often. I mean, it's unique in that regard. And I kind of felt like, from my perspective, not based on anything, obviously, just kind of keeping up with this and hearing what you have to say, when you report on our website, it always kind of felt like to me, like probably one of the guys will soften. Either Bo will be like, Jaden's your guy, or Jaden will kind of be like, we kind of see how it's going. They're kind of flipping toward Bo, whatever, right? That's kind of how it felt like it was going to probably go eventually for me. And we're about to shift into March, and it doesn't seem like either guy is softening. Like you just said, Bo's still coming in next weekend. He loves OU. That was kind of his dream school in a lot of ways. And Jaden, he's coming for Champion Barbecue, like you just said. He's still at the forefront of this class. He's still recruiting other guys to join him. Wide receivers in particular, we've talked about his relationship with Mason James and other guys. Like, it kind of seems like both guys are still just barreling ahead. Jaden obviously committed to OU, and Bo potentially being committed down the road. So it's very interesting, and it's something that we'll continue to monitor. Collin's been all over it, and it's just very interesting. It is. It's going to be fun to continue to watch. And if Oklahoma can get both guys, great for OU, obviously. Great for
Dream scenario.
Let's shift to the guys protecting them. You mentioned in 2025, the offensive line obviously was the centerpiece of the class. Michael Fasusi, Ryan Foje at the heart of that. Offensive line in 2026, we've talked about some big names in the past on the show, like Felix Ojo, among others. For you, I guess the storylines here on the offensive line and how they're going to try and build on what was that tremendous 2025 group, obviously going into 2026 now.
Yeah, so here's, to me, what really stands out. And I've mentioned this, but this is, to me, an opportunity to really dive into this a little bit further because there's a couple of layers to this. Number one, as I've mentioned, 2026 is just not considered as talented or deep of a cycle compared to 2025 or even what 2027 will be. I know that sounds crazy to say, but like, I'm a recruiting guy. That's my job.
Yeah.
So in 2026, I do believe kind of within that sentiment, it really takes shape when you talk about the offensive line, because we're coming off a historic cycle in 2025 for the offensive tackle position specifically. Again, never before did 9 offensive linemen receive 5-star status, 8 of them being offensive tackles. And now you go into 2026, I think 2 things. Number one, the offensive tackle position, specifically in the region for Oklahoma, I mean, outside of Felix Ojo, it's not looking good, Chief. Like it might be a little bit of slim pickings, and Oklahoma's already kind of been ruled out too for some of the nation's elite at offensive tackle. I'm talking about Jackson Cantwell. I'm talking about Emmanuel Iheanacho. So you're kind of fighting an uphill battle there, but then also because of what you were able to do in 2025, you're probably going to have to deal with that as well, because a lot of these guys at the offensive tackle position may not necessarily want to sign on to potentially be backups to the likes of Michael Fasusi or Ryan Fauché. And then that gets into kind of the rabbit hole that I mentioned to you and our listeners and viewers here on the show like a week or two ago. It's also that gets you into the territory of, okay, if these guys are hesitant because of who's already in the room, a grade above them, we're going to have to spend more money. How much money can we spend? Not are we willing? How much can we spend after the likes of Michael Fasusi comes in the door? And we've dedicated to that guy, not just future-wise, but financially, to be our left tackle for the franchise. So there's that at offensive tackle. It's slim pickings. It's a lot of competition. It's a level of awareness that's going to hurt you. How OU plans to navigate that, I think is fascinating. And then this is the other big thing I wanted to talk about on the offensive line. Very slim pickings at offensive tackle. Depending on how you view the level of talent, I do think there are some pretty quality players in a sense that you might take like one offensive tackle in this class. You could take like 5 interior linemen if you wanted to. I mean, I genuinely believe that if OU felt strongly enough about particular interior offensive linemen or guys that are maybe more interior projections but have the ability to, let's say, play right tackle, this cycle specifically on OU's board, and folks can go, if you're a VIP subscriber, again, join us if you want to hop aboard, $1 for your first month. Like I think I published like 10, 11 names at guard in this class alone that OU is not only involved with, but honestly, they're in pretty good standing for a number of these cats. So I think that's something rare that you never really see, is like there's this surplus of guards and centers. And yeah, some of them have the ability to play tackle, but they're probably not suited to do that at the collegiate level to the highest of ability. And while that's kind of weird, it's also like, okay, maybe Oklahoma says, if we just find one offensive tackle we really like, and we think one of these guys can play at tackle, we've got Fauché and Fasusi into the fold. Let's really beef up the offensive line of scrimmage with some high school recruits and honestly get them while they're cheapest, right? So another fascinating layer, in my opinion, within this storyline.
No, it's really interesting because, like you said, especially the aspect of when you have this 25 group, which was so good. We talked about it throughout the cycle and obviously on signing day and things like that. How much do you invest in that in 26? Because, yeah, you like the idea of stacking groups and really having all that depth. But it's also like we just had a great cycle before. Do we want to spread resources and things like that? Do we want to go all in on a number of high? It's interesting. It's interesting decisions that have to be made. And that's why you bring in a guy like Jim Nagy to help you. Like, these are decisions that have to be made that necessarily weren't in days of old with allocating, again, your funds and your resources. These are tough decisions. So very intrigued in that. Obviously, off the great year, the cycle that Bill Beanmo just had in 25. What does 26 look like on top of that is definitely really intriguing. As far as over on the defensive side, what are some front seven guys? Obviously, on the defensive line and the linebacker spot, we kind of talked about this a little bit on Monday with James and Tom. We did the linebacker status report. They've only signed one linebacker each of the last 2 years. And now this season, you come in, you love your talent at the top, but it's kind of thin. You don't have that many guys because, again, you've only signed one the last 2 years. Obviously, defensive line, we've talked about a number of times, has been really solid. Miguel Chavis doing a great job on the edges. Todd Bates doing a great job on the interior. They've signed a number of big-name dudes. The guys who have been there have produced pretty well. For you on the defensive side, what are some things that stand out to you? And do you see them signing more linebackers, for lack of a more articulate question? I mean, what's kind of the where do your eyes go as far as that side of it on the defensive side?
It really was a case where I'm going through the position by position series and I'm trying to formulate another storyline to talk about. And I wrote the linebackers piece today. And as I was prepping to write it last night, I'm going through the board. I'm like, man, there is a real opportunity for OU to piece together a quality haul at linebacker and defensive line. And it's exactly like you mentioned too. You signed one linebacker the last 2 years, Marcus James the year prior. But I think two coming off the heels of 2025, Josh. Like, think about it. They signed one freshman defensive tackle in 2025 in Trent Wilson.
Yeah, right.
They sign, let's just call him an enigma in CJ Nixon at the edge position, a guy that's probably going to take a couple years to develop. They bring in Alex Shieldknight, who quality player, but maybe the ceiling is a little bit limited long-term, right, in terms of just being a solid, steady, rotational defender.
And had a significant injury late this past season, too, that will delay him.
So it's coming off the heels of 2025, especially. It's like, man, you look at 2026, and I wrote the defensive end board, I wrote the defensive tackle board, and then I wrote the linebacker board. And out of those three pieces, I was like, they are involved with some heavy, heavy hitters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just they're involved. They're positioned well for a number of these guys. Like a defensive end, they've shown you. They want KJ Ford and Jake Kroll as bad as anybody in the country. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to go after that duo. And then there's some others at the edge positions that they are in a pretty solid spot for as well. Defensive tackle, there's like 6, 7 4-star caliber players that they're getting ready to host on campus, might get an official visit out of, they're in the running for. I mean, there's an elite defensive tackle in state down the street from you out there in Tulsa, in Taj Overton, who you had an opportunity to lock up within state lines. And that's only really scratching the surface of some of the other defensive tackles. And then at linebacker, I believe the headline I put together today was linebacker is loaded at a time where the Sooners are on the hunt. I mean, this linebacker-centric staff is going to go all in at the position in 2026, and it sets up really nicely for them considering the amount of talent at that position in 26. And so, again, the thing that I had running through my mind was in 2025, in the front seven, in that specific context, like they got some quality players, but they really have to kind of reach a new level to accomplish some depth goals and make sure you're consistently filling out the roster at those premium positions. And in 2026, man, even though, again, the overall talent level may be down, what a time to have the class pretty heavily oriented towards defensive linemen and linebackers, right? You can't take that for granted. To already be positioned well with a number of them is honestly a blessing for Oklahoma. And now it's about pushing this thing across the finish line with a lot of these guys, because if you do, you could assemble one heck of a group within the front seven, a area of the field where, again, the Sooner staff is so heavily invested.
Feels like a reload spot, right? I mean, it's kind of, these positions have been the strength of the team as far as the current team. Obviously, the linebacker spot was great last year with Danny Stutzman leading the charge. And we talked about how good they were on the edges in the interior, stopping the run and getting after the pass a little bit. Our Mason Thomas had a great year, and he's back. Like, these positions have been really good, but they haven't, like we just mentioned, only signed one linebacker each last 2 years, just the one D tackle. Like, they haven't added a ton through the high school ranks. Not a ton. Some really good players, but not a ton in terms of just pure volume. So this year, after this coming season where these positions should all be really good again, but you're going to lose some of them. I mean, Kip Lewis, R. Mason Thomas, Dominic Williams, these are all guys that are going to go to the NFL after this year, presumably. You have a chance to kind of replenish on top of those classes that we had a couple years ago with those young guys coming up on the edge. Your Danny Okoye's who are going into year two, and Wyatt Gilmore, that group. And obviously year two for the D tackles, David Stone, Jay Jackson. It's like you bring this cycle through. If you can land some of these names that Collin just went through, and you kind of have that next group up, right? This is kind of the time to get it. So they've kind of paced themselves well, or frankly, I think the approach has been smart. And you mentioned this 26 class has got a lot of really talented defensive players that they're after. So it kind of, if it goes to plan, it really was handled quite well, frankly, and we'll see how it shakes out. But it just makes sense. Feels like this is the class that kind of stock back up at these defensive front seven positions, and we'll keep an eye on it as we go along over the next several months into the summer. But it's exciting. If you're an OU fan, you've loved what you've done defensively with Brent Venables and his staff. A lot to be excited about in this 26 cycle for sure.
Yeah, pretty ridiculous timing or coincidence when you think about it, because not often do you get to talk about both quality and quantity at positions like inside linebacker or defensive line.
Right.
But OU has a shot at both in 2026. And again, for a staff like this, that's incredibly exciting with how much they're willing to invest into those position groups.
No doubt. And Collin, if you want to check out all his work with the position kind of breakdowns and storylines, it's all, again, over on the website, Sooners Illustrated, Oklahoma.247sports.com. Like you said, you can get first month for $1 right now if you become a VIP member. And it's just a great time. Spring ball, Diamond Sports, it's a great time to jump aboard with us over at Sooners Illustrated. I think that's it for now. We'll be back next week. Like Collin said, big weekend coming up on the recruiting side next weekend. Some big names will be in town, including Bo Bentley. We'll talk about all that next week and kind of preview that. Obviously, James, Tom, myself will be back on the show on Monday as we'll recap the weekends that were for basketball and, of course, the Diamond Sports as well. And we'll preview the start of spring practice because that is next week. So it's kind of snuck up. It's a lot earlier this year. It's like a solid 2 weeks earlier than normal this year. So be ready. Get your mind right because we've got a lot of spring practice coverage coming in the very near future. And we'll kind of preview that a little bit on the show on Monday. That's it for now. For Collin Kennedy, I'm Josh Callaway signing off. We'll see you next time right back here, as always, on the Sooners Illustrated podcast.